Okay, we might get going then. Right, might start by paying our respects to elders, past, present and emerging. We celebrate the stories, culture and traditions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders of all communities who also work and live on this land. And you can see I'll be clicking the enter button for a little bit. So today's agenda, we'll explore customised employment, its origins, underpinning philosophy. Your microphone, please, if you could mute it. We'll explore discovery, the purpose and practices. We'll discuss the NDIS and employment, and in particular reference to how the NDIS treats employment, particularly in the area of capacity building. And then we'll finish at the end with some questions and a discussion. What I'd ask is if you could keep your questions to the end, and then you can pop them in the chat area. What I find webinars, if I try to answer questions while I'm going along, I tend to get a little lost and sort of lose where I'm at, and it becomes a bit waffly. So let's just not do that. Okay, so that's the agenda, and let's get going. You can see I'll be pressing that button for a while. Okay, so customised employment. Well, what is it? It's simply a flexible strategy that responds to legislation and policy and practice, in particular what we see. So it's, in that sense, it's a bit of a circular thing. So it's a client-driven employment strategy that builds individual capacity and employment for people that traditionally are marginalised or have significant barriers to employment. It has a growing evidence base. That highlight its characteristics and its practices, which are important, that we need to match those to fidelity to the model. So we do it with some authenticity, because there is a fidelity scale which the Americans have developed, which we've been modifying for a little while. Hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have that document available, as that research is being done in conjunction with our friends at Customised. Microphones and cameras, please, if you could. So where did it come from? Well, it has a long history in the sense that it evolved out of person-centered philosophies that started to appear in education, employment and human services in the 70s and 80s. We had in the US, if you could mute your microphone, please. We started to see this appear in Australia and in the US, and particularly it started to come out of special schools. That person who's currently got their camera, if they could mute this one, please. Margaret, if you could mute that. There we go. So what happened was you had these philosophies starting to appear where people are starting to look at kids in particular and go, okay, where's the best place to learn about employment skills? And in the US, you had people like Lou Brown at the University of Wisconsin. Please mute your cameras and your microphones. It's providing feedback, which is distracting. So what was happening is, if you take Lou Brown and his group, they were looking at individual education plans and looking at what was the best place to learn about work for kids with disability. And they determined that, rather than having a kid go into a simulated cafe or coffee shop or canteen of the school, let's get the kid to go down the street and go to a cafe and experience that. Let's get them to learn how to travel on a bus and use public transport, because this is the best place to learn. Because these are the things that you need to understand if you're going to have a job. Because let's face it, where does a job start? It starts here in your home. You have to leave your home. And if you can't do that, then employment isn't possible. So at the same time as this was going on, we had similar things in Australia going on, where we, in the 70s and 80s, where people like Jerry Ford and Trevor Parmenter, Roy Brown, etc., were looking at this. They were coming out of special education and kind of going, okay, what should we do? And in the early part, or mid to late part of last century in Australia, they trialled things called work prep centres, which was take the kids out of school, and put them into workplaces. And in these cases, they were simulated workplaces to teach them employment skills as a step to employment in the community. And of course, we used to call that place and train or place and support. So it's not a new concept in that sense. But what happened in the year 2000s under the Clinton administration in America was they developed what is now known as the Office of Disability Employment Policy. And what happened in that particular office was they decided that, there's all these different people doing employment for people with disability. Let's get them together and see what they're doing. So they got people like Kerry Griffin and Dave Hamas, Mike Callahan, David Mank, about 20 odd people came together. And what they discovered was they were all essentially doing the same thing. They were doing it in different parts of America. They were using the same underpinning philosophies and starting to develop what we now call customized employment. And it was actually offered the ODEP, and I've forgotten the woman's surname, Chris, who Carrie suggested to me has come up with the term customized employment. And what they discovered was because they're all using this similar philosophy, they kind of went, okay, so what are we going to call this? What's the underpinning practice in customized employment? And Mike Callahan called his discovery, and Carrie Griffin and his group, they call theirs discovering personal genius. At the end of the day, they're very similar. The outcomes are the same in the sense that it's all about the individual and in a job in the community with the same conditions as everybody else. A real wage, real conditions, real awards, real career opportunities. So that's kind of where it came from. And it's continued to evolve from there. And we've had a technical alliance with Griffin Hamas for more than a decade now, a decade and a half. And that's where actually I learned my customized employment. I actually learned under Carrie in the States. So I've got a little bit of a bias in that sense, although Mike Callahan, who's now retired, Mike's an old friend of mine as well. And, at the end of the day, whichever philosophy you use, you're going to end up in the same place, just there's variations to it. So, one of the things that happened over the years was, it started to develop, and it now has a framework, and that framework looks like this. In a sense that customized employment is effectively 4 parts. It is discovery, part 1, which is about the individual and understanding the individual. This part 2 is about engaging with their community, their family, their friends, their neighbours, to find out all those little hidden skills that people, have, but no one recognises it. And a simple example of that, and I'll come back to that first, but job development is the next stage. And then you go to post-placement. This is crucial for employment longevity, having a plan. This is one of the things that over the years that, we've been able to understand, and in actual fact, this is not my words. I mean, Carrie said this to me a decade or more ago, and he said, the way to understand if someone actually understands customized employment is to get them to describe it. And if they say it's discovery and job carving or job development, then they probably got it wrong, because it's more complex than that. If you look at this 4-part model here, this pie, and you think, okay, that seems relatively straightforward. Well, in the States where they certify customized employment specialists or disability employment support specialists, it's quite an intense training program. It's quite an intense exam. I sat the exam a number of years ago in the States, and there's 140 questions in it, and it covers 4 to 5 domains, and it's quite an intense program. So it's not a simple exercise of, okay, fill out a form and then go off and do job carving, because it's not. Job carving in itself is simply an accommodation. So what is customized employment? It's a capacity building tool, particularly discovery, that builds on a person's strengths, interests, and skills. Let me come back to part 2, where I mentioned all these hidden abilities. One of the commonest things that you see is that families rightfully often say that, well, my child doesn't have a lot of skills and abilities. And that's simply a reflection of what they see. And in many cases, it's driven by the security blanket that families put around their children. We all do that. And often what you'll see is you can be at a family's home and the young person will, they're going to feed the dog. They've gone out and they've made a cup of tea. They've made coffee. They've started cooking a meal, vacuumed, tidied up, and all this sort of stuff. And you kind of go, well, they're all skills. But as a rule, we tend not to recognize them as skills. But all of those things point to skills that are transferable, that you can build on for employment. And this is this idea that when people say, well, they have a disability, so therefore they're not employable, that's nonsense. We're just not looking at people properly. Everybody is employable in some form or fashion, in some setting, if we understand their interests, their skills, their strengths, the things that make them get out of bed, the things that make them passionate. The reason you're sitting here because you have an interest in this. So what about the kid with a disability? What about the adult with a disability? So these are the things that, that really underpin customized employment. And in a sense, you can start to see it's a philosophy. It's a philosophy in action. And in that sense, it's exactly the same as person-centered planning, and that is that it's a philosophy in action. And, to give you some pointers about this, some of the earliest ways that customized employment was evolving was that, Carrie will tell you that, they took person-centered planning and they were doing this with people and people were still in poverty. So they added financial planning to person-centered planning, and that became the basis for their evolution of discovery, their version of it. And in Australia, we use a version that was based on the Griffin-Hamus version, and it's evolved to meet our funding model, because I think this is one of the things that people don't quite get. The reality is that customized employment and discovery will look different in different countries because it evolves to meet the funding mechanisms that countries have. In America, for instance, they have 3 different layers of funding. So if you want to do employment for someone with a disability, you've got to look for money locally, you've got to look for state, you've got to look for federal. You don't get as much as you might think. So you've got to what they call braid a whole lot of different funding and services together if you want to pursue employment. In Australia, we don't need to do that. We have an NDIS, which delivers more than adequate funding for individuals to pursue employment. Some people would suggest it might not. But if you understand discovery and customized employment, it's actually very easy to navigate the NDIS. We'll come to that a little bit later on. So over the last few years, the last few decades, the evidence base has been growing, and we've been publishing and researching in that. And 4 years ago now, Victoria Commonwealth University in Virginia, Katie Inge decided, what are the characteristics of customized employment? So what Katie did was she got a whole bunch of subject matter experts, about 25 from memory, together, and basically polled them all through a group of surveys, and then doing a consensus review. They distilled customized employment down to 12 characteristics, and these are the characteristics. And the first one is physically meet at the location of an individual's choosing. And often customized employment and discovery will start in a person's home. And what I will say to you, in our employment service, and we have an employment service called Work First, which works with NDIS clients. It came about through basically parents approaching us and saying, can you help us? And at the same time, because we do research, and research is significant if you're going to build an evidence base, it provided us an opportunity to actually gather evidence firsthand. Now, what I will say is that we've never had a client come to our office. We meet all of our clients in their community or in their home, because that's where you get to see the real person. That's where they're comfortable. I mean, who's been comfortable going to an office? And if you have a disability, you probably don't like it. And so the best place is, where does the client want to live? Meet you, and that'll be where they live. The second part is to build rapport and get to know the individual. And if you think that's the first part of discovery, getting to know the individual and mindfully listen to the person. I'm not an expert in anybody's life. I'm hardly an expert in my own life. So what makes me think I can go to someone and say, this is what you need to do, and this is the best thing for you, and I got a job for you? Oh, that's nonsense. You need to listen to a person and really develop rapport and empathy and understand where they're coming from, because we want to identify their interests, their skills, their abilities. And where are we going to do that? We're going to see that around their home. We're going to see it in the community. We're going to go into places where they light up, where the things that interest them and where the things that don't interest them, because it's just as important to understand what someone doesn't like, because that also starts to tell you about what are their ideal conditions of employment. Go and conduct interviews with family and friends, because they'll know things. If someone could turn that microphone off, that would be great. Because often we'll go, okay, someone will say, well, I'm not sure if they've got any skills or abilities, but you go and meet their uncle or their neighbours down the road, and what do they do down there? Well, they mow the lawn. So you might think, okay, well, that's interesting. So go down there and see what they do. And you know what? They actually do it all without prompting. So that starts to tell you that they have a whole range of skills around self-determination and acting with volition. And these are things that people don't necessarily identify as a skill, but in actual fact, they are. They are skills that you can build on. I supported a young man probably 20 years ago now, and when I joined an organisation that was doing employment, and they said, go out with this gentleman. If you could turn the microphone off, Reese, I think. And I said, okay, so what am I doing? So I went out there with some of the staff, and they did all the work while the client just wandered around. And I went, well, this is rubbish. This is the client's job. This is about him doing something he wants to do and doing it meaningfully. So when I went back the next week by myself, I said to the young man, I said, what would you like me to do? And he said, go and have coffee. He said, I can do this. I went, okay. So I went and saw the store manager, and he went, yeah, he's a great worker. He does a whole lot of things. So, I sat there in a coffee shop, and every 10 minutes he'd walk past doing the work he was doing, and he'd wave to me. And every half hour or so I'd go and have a look, and he'd be going along nicely. And you know what? I wasn't interfering in the relationship between that young man and his employer. I was observing him. And what I discover is that he's got a lot of abilities, so you've got to go out with your clients into the community and put them in employment situations where they can try things. That's what work experience is. Work experience builds capacity. Observe the person in daily activities, a number of different community settings. Don't go to one place, go to a few places, because what you do here might be different from what you do there, and you'll see different skills, because we're building up that picture of the person. Arrange for them, for a job seeker, to observe local businesses that match their interests, their skills and abilities. And this is about not looking for a job. This is about trying to understand the person. What gets them excited? What abilities do they have? What hidden skills? Go and conduct information interviews with local employers that are representative of the client's interests, skills, and abilities. And often people go, should I have a client with me? Yeah, if you understand, absolutely. But if you don't have a client, or you're sitting there in your office, go out and talk to employers. Go out and do an informational interview. Very rarely, as a matter of fact, once probably in the last decade or more, have I had an employer say, no, they didn't want to talk to me. And depending on the attitude of that employer and how they treat me, that's going to tell me something about whether that's a business where they really support someone with a disability. Go out and observe a job seeker engaging in job-related tasks. And that doesn't mean they say they're interested in fashion. Let's go to a clothing store so they can try clothes on. That's kind of not a job, trying clothes on. Well, maybe it is if you're an influencer. I don't know. But, what's the job-related task in that? Well, the job-related task would be if someone comes in and tries clothes on, you get them, fold them, iron them, whatever, repackage them, put them back on the shelf. That's a job-related task. Assist the job seeker in identifying work experiences to identify job interests, skills, and abilities. And remember, we're not doing job development right here. We're still in the discovery phase. Collaborate with the job seeker, family, and friends in confirming their interests, skills and abilities. And then we'll get to the idea of negotiating a customized job description. So this is what they identified as the characteristics of customized employment. In many ways, first 11 really are, more than anything else, the characteristics of discovery. So it's all about discovering a person's strengths. It's all about answering two fundamental questions. You know, who is this person and what are their ideal conditions of employment? That's what we're trying to answer. You know, and one of the outcomes of that discovery process, and by the way, I used artificial intelligence software to actually design the elements of this particular presentation. So this is an interesting thing to also think about when you start to think about employment. Where does the future of work and artificial intelligence impact on the client's work and conditions? That's just a sideline. So where do we get to? At the end of discovery, you should end up with a detailed job plan that highlights vocational themes. So what are we trying to identify? We're trying to identify 3 vocational pathways. And a vocational pathway isn't a job. It could be things like transport. And within transport, there are lots of employment themes and opportunities. It could be hospitality. And again, there are lots of things in there as well. So we're not trying to initially identify a particular job where they can go and drop a resume in. We're not going to do that. Very rarely do we use resumes in our work with clients. So it's about identifying vocational themes that show potential employment pathways, and then some employers where you can go and do some informational interviews where that matches up with your interests and skills, and that starts to guide job development. So the ideal outcome of discovery is a direction for a job in the community with the same pay and conditions as everybody else. Because after all, that's what we want. So let me give you a little comment here in relation to work experience. And this is important to understand. You know, a lot of people see work experience as a one-off thing you might do at school, for instance, like let's go and do some work experience. Yes, we've ticked that box. Thank you very much. But work experience is a fundamental skill-building element of customized employment. But not only does it build skills, but it also normalizes the expectation of work and builds capacity along with self-determination and self-advocacy skills. The reality is that skills people pick up in work experience, they do not lose, right? It's a building block. You know, we've got kids in our program as young as 14. As a matter of fact, the youngest one in our program started at the age of 13. And you can see through multiple and lots of work experiences how they're becoming more complex and how the abilities of the young people are growing. But by the time they get to that point in their school journey where we start to go, okay, now let's start to look seriously at the employment pathway for you, we'll have a really clear understanding of their skills, their abilities, their interests. We'll have a very clearly identified the pathway for them, 3 pathways, and which will help us because, you know, often what you find is that with these 3 particular vocational themes that you develop, they overlap, you know, and they end up with a myriad of opportunities, not simply, oh, guess what, you're going to work in a coffee shop. Well, you know, coffee shops are the current thing where everybody opens a social enterprise and a coffee shop and everybody learns how to make coffee and that sort of stuff. And that's great if you want to work in hospitality. But let's not pigeonhole people into one area because, you know, kids and adults with a disability have all the potential as everybody else. We just kind of ignore that because they have a disability. So work experience is an essential element of discovery and it underpins customized employment. This is where we get to the really interesting thing, and I noticed in the registration today there's a lot of people with education department email addresses, so you know I've tailored this a little bit to add a bit more detail for you guys. So when it comes to transitioning from school, kids with disabilities face significant challenges from inaccessible classrooms to lack of accommodations. But self-determination and with self-determination and support, or rather determination and support, children can overcome these obstacles and succeed academically. What's interesting about that is that's what the artificial intelligence wrote when I put in transition from school. Fascinating, this stuff. But the important thing here is to recognize those words, determination and support. These are capacity building. That's what that's about, capacity building. Because one of the things that we focus on, and you should be focusing on through work experience and supporting someone through discovery, is building their capacity to self-determine and self-advocate. Those two things are essential. You can mute your microphone, please. Those two things are essential in a workplace because they translate to having a voice and using it, choice and control. It's really that simple. So one of the interesting things about transition, and there's lots of ways to do transition, but it's really not done that well. I mean, you would have to argue that, or you could just simply argue that if you look at the success rates of employment for young people with disability, it's pretty poor, and it has been for decades. And that's because of the disconnect. And we're trying to do transition too late, and that's simply a recognition that the education system is overwhelmed by teaching kids, and employment isn't necessarily a priority. And when you're time poor, absolutely, we get that. So over the years, we've developed programs, and about 4 years ago, we built a program based on the work that we've been doing in the States and the evolution of what was called peer discovery or group guided discovery. And we trialed a program in Canberra. And it worked brilliantly. And it's based on discovery, which is a discovery-based transition, worked in small groups. It can be done in the school, it can be done in a public setting, but it's a peer-led program that results in skill building and develops a blueprint for employment and post-school study, because this is also a really interesting that we tend to forget. You know, most of us finish high school with an idea of where we're going. Well, not all of us, but certainly, you know, a lot of people do. But if you have a disability, you probably don't. You usually offered one or two pathways. But what we're trying to do with our programs, and we think this is something that should happen for everybody, when you finish school, you should have a blueprint for success. You know, most kids with a disability finish with a referral to a service provider that can potentially, as I've said, set them up for a life of dependency and poverty. And that's not the AI, that's me. And that's based on my 20 years of working in disability and what I've seen in supporting families. So, but what would happen if a kid with a disability and their family had a backup plan based on real work experience and real job prospects? You know, they would finish school with a pathway, whether that's employment or further study. That's entirely up to them based on what we discover while they're at school. Why can't a kid with a disability go to university? You know, there are programs all over the world. We've got a few in Australia where kids transition from high school to university. In America, they're about to start through the ICI at the University of Massachusetts, who are leading it. They're about to start a national program of putting in place the processes and accreditation so that kids with a disability can transition from high school to university. No, go somewhere else and think about it and hope like hell someone will help you. This is a real program. And this is the things that we base our work on. We work with the University of Massachusetts and the ICI. I have done for decades. And they do some brilliant things. We're not there here in Australia. Hopefully we will be. But let's at least finish school with a blueprint for success rather than a referral. I think that's a really important one for us to consider going forward. So where does the NDIS come into this? Well, it actually comes into it as soon as possible. But the NDIS is first and foremost a capacity building support scheme, and that might sound odd to some people, but it should be obvious because it's divided into capital, core, and capacity. Core, capacity. And if you think about it, core supports are your everyday needs. Capital supports, of course, are the big things like homes and vehicles and stuff like that. But capacity building is about building independence and skills to help you pursue your goals. And that includes employment. And a lot of people kind of miss that point with the NDIS. And, you know, one of the things that we often see is there's a whole range of myths around it. But if you look at employment in the NDIS, if you look at it through the single lens of finding a job and keeping a job, you deny young people the opportunity to grow, to develop, to experience, and ultimately pursue employment and career. You've got to look at the NDIS and go, you know what, the support categories that you use to support a young person or even an adult actually determine what you deliver to an individual. If you simply focus on find a job and keep a job, you're going to shortchange kids, because you're going to look at that and go, well, how do we actually do this work with that limited amount of funding? But if you look at it from the perspective of its capacity building, then there are real opportunities to fund growth and develop the individual. So if you take a capacity building approach to employment and not simply a job approach, it means that you can innovate in how you deliver and what you deliver. You know, we don't use in our program, for instance, and we have about 40 individuals in our program at the moment. We don't use find a job and keep a job. We use the capacity building line items that support what the individual wants and what they want to achieve. And by doing it in the community, it opens up more opportunities, because, you know, if you've never been exposed to employment, you're not going to see a lot from at home. You need to go out and we need to take people into the community and facilitate opportunities to see what employment looks like. And, you know, and over the years, I've had staff say to me, you know, I've got a client who wants to be a fireman, but I don't think they're capable. Like, well, maybe they don't want to be a fireman. What you need to do is you need to go to the fire station and see what it is that really interests them about being a fireman. It might not be a fireman. It might be the bright lights and the sirens. It might be they want to drive a truck. There's a whole range of things that are there that you can kind of go, so which are the things that really interest them and what do they point to? You know, if it's like, oh, I'd love to be able to drive a truck or be in a truck. Okay, we're starting to see a transport theme here. You know, so you could explore that. There's lots of things in that. So you've got to look at it from that perspective and open your eyes. It's as much about opening your eyes to the opportunities that you can support the client to experience and then achieve. You know, this is where, in some ways, because people have taken a very narrow focus of employment in the NDIS, that, to me, short-sighted providers have sort of created a whole range of barriers to employment for young people with a disability. And I think this is really something we have to overcome. So when you look at employment in the NDIS, and particularly if the kids are still in school, you need to look at their NDIS funding and go, you know what, as a school, we can't do this. But they have NDIS funding, capacity building. So who do we need to partner with for that organisation to come and work with the kids while they're in the school to give them those opportunities to experience employment? If you wait till when someone is finishing school, it's too late. You know, if you're going to pursue the employment process at the age of 18, they're now having to compete and start the journey when everybody else already has an idea of where they want to go. If you can start earlier, and it might only be an hour a week, you know, where they go out and they have a work experience of a Saturday or of an afternoon for an hour or two, where they can actually experience what employment looks like. What you start to do is you don't just build the capacity of the young person. What you do is you normalize the expectation of employment for the family. Because I guarantee you, the family would love their child to have the same opportunities that they have. And they can, if we do this properly and with a purpose. So start early. You know, they've started employment in the States, in some states, as young as 12. And the evidence tells us that starting work experiences at the age of 12 really guide a person and help them grow and develop, you know, so they've got a clearer idea and the family goes, you know what, my kid's going to work just like everybody else. And they can, because, you know, the NDIS is here to facilitate that. I mean, you know, I've got families, significant numbers of families that have disabilities. I mean, I have a 9-year-old grandson who for the last year and a half has studied with the Australian Ballet. He's just recently performed with the Victorian State Ballet. He's currently training with the Victorian Youth Ballet, and he'll be performing next month in Snow White. And he will be one of what they now call the woodcutters, which used to be called the Seven Dwarfs. They're now called the woodcutters. And now, this is a young man that was born of complex disability on the spectrum, at an end of the spectrum where people would go, yeah, no. But you know what? This through the NDIS supports and through his exposure to things that interest him, that he wants to pursue, he is going ahead in leaps and bounds. And for me, he's kind of my poster child for what helping someone pursue their dreams and their interests can lead to. So start early, start often, and keep going. Don't simply stop after one. Work experiences, as they get more complex, lead a person to that job that they want, because it builds skills in increments. It's a step process, kind of what we do in school. So I talked about some myths. Let's have a look at some of the myths. First one is that the NDIS doesn't fund customised employment. Well, the NDIS doesn't fund any type of employment methodology. Go and have a look. It doesn't mention methodologies. Why doesn't it mention methodologies? Because it wants you as a service provider, as a school teacher, as an institution to go, you know what, we're going to explore a whole lot of things, because, customised employment might not work for this person. So maybe they need IPS, which is an individual placement support for people that have severe mental illness. We have a version of IPS which we develop for our clients, particularly, and we use it primarily with our clients that are on the spectrum. Because we tend to find many of the young people on the spectrum we work with have very black and white ideas where they want to go. So we start there. And that's about starting with the client where you find them. The other myth is that school leaver employment support, or funding, or SLES as it's called, it's now shortly going to be called Youth Employment Supports, I think, is a program with fixed payments. Well, that's a nonsense. It's not a program. It's simply additional funding that someone can have in their NDIS funding package that's dedicated to developing employment pathways. That's all it is. It's not a program. It's not based on you can only do so many hours a week. That's a complete and utter myth. The other myth, which has been, it's been common for decades now, is that you can learn customised employment and discovery in 2 days. Well, no, you can't. In America, where they've set a standard, customised employment is generally about 120 hours of study, reading, and practice before you get to that point where you'll understand it enough to go out and try it and get it wrong. And it'll take about 12 months of getting it wrong before the light bulbs will go on. Discovery takes about 40 hours, and that's it. That's the minimum in the States. And what we've done in ourselves in our own training college, where we've modified and evolved what they do in the States, simply because we need to reflect our legislation and funding model. And what we see in our community, the same thing. It's the same complex thing. Customised employment is quite complex to learn. Discovery, for most people, is probably what they need to understand first. And you can, if you get that, then you're on your way to finding employment. Discovery isn't about employment. That's job development. So there's some of the weird myths. The thing about job development, and that's where you end up after you have your blueprint, and this is important to recognize, is that job development isn't job carving or writing resumes for online applications. If you're going to send a resume in today, guess what? You're one of 400 resumes. The last time we advertised for a job, we had 500 applications. When you filter through them all, you discover that there's only a half a dozen that actually match up to the criteria. But if you're going down that path, what's going to happen, and particularly for kids with a disability, the algorithms are going to exclude you. You're going to be competing against people that don't have disabilities, where in this day and age, employers will kind of go, well, let's find the most appropriate person, the easiest person we can get on. And that's not that people don't want to employ young people, adults with a disability. It's just that we've done a very good job of telling people that it's actually quite complex to do that, and it's not. Job development, you can see in the job development pyramid, the hierarchy that we created, is that it's about understanding the client and understanding the employer. That's kind of the discovery bits, if you think about it, because customised employment and employment through discovery ultimately is based on the idea of mutuality and reciprocity. In other words, we find the ideal conditions of employment for the individual that meet the demands of an employer, so that the employer is getting what they want, a valued employee that can do the job that they need in order to generate income, in order to pay the wages to keep that person employed. And that person is getting a job that meets their interests, their skills, and their abilities, where they can grow and have a career. So you need to understand those two things first. And of course, then that leads to job analysis, task analysis, and then maybe job creation or carving. Job carving in itself is simply an accommodation. We all have accommodations. What we're doing here is an accommodation. When we're not meeting face-to-face, we're meeting using Zoom. That's an accommodation. Years ago, we wouldn't have done that. And certainly prior to COVID, we would have avoided it like the plague. If you've got a mobile phone or a smartphone, it's an accommodation. So accommodations aren't complex. They're actually generally very simple. And in my experience, I find a lot of people with a disability already know the accommodations they need for the workplace. And of course, we have a program that the federal government runs called Job Access, which will fund workplace accommodations for everyone with a disability that wants to pursue employment. So it's not as complex as we might think, but we've done a pretty good job of muddying the water in that sense. So customized employment is a practice method that supports capacity building and inclusion based on individual skills, preferences, and choices. If you master the basics of it, you can go anywhere with it. We are astounded by the things that we learn and what we can do with discovery. You actually discover that weirdly enough, I'm using the word, if you understand discovery, what you discover is that you actually do it all the time. If you think about informational interviews, which is one aspect of customized employment, people kind of get freaked out by, oh my God, I've got to go and talk to an employer that I don't know, that I've never met, into a strange workplace. We do it all the time. If you go into a supermarket and you stand there and you have a conversation with the person at the checkout, that's an informational interview. It's as simple as that. My good friend Debbie Ball, who's the vice president of Easter Seals and is the head of their disability employment program in California, and her client base, is a state with 26 million people in it, so it's bigger than Australia. One of the things that she does with her new staff is they will freak out at the idea of an informational interview. But on their first day, she said, look, on your way home, go to a shop you've never been to and come and I want you to discover 3 things about that business and come back and tell me tomorrow. And when they come back tomorrow, they go, hey, I found these 3 things. And as she says, she congratulates them and says, guess what? You've done an informational interview. So a lot of the barriers that we have around doing customized employment and supporting people are actually our barriers, because we're afraid to step out of our comfort zone. If we do that, then you'd be amazed at the things that we can support a person to achieve. So that's 45 minutes. So I hope you've got something from that. Let's open up the chat. And if you have any questions, let's go. If you don't, that's fine. And I'll simply thank those that have attended. Okay, Sean, other line items. Yeah, I do actually. What we do is we tend to look at the capacity building line items that focus on activities in the community. And if you look closely at them, they allow you to explore the community, because it's about building a capacity. If you think about it, going out into the community of someone, how they've got to learn how to get there, that's capacity building. Engaging in the community, it is the same as engaging with employers in the community. So if you email me, Sean, what I'll do is I can send you actually some of the line items we use. I probably should have put it on a slide, but I'll get that to you. I'm looking blankly at a screen, waiting, seeing if there's any questions. So look, what I would simply say about the whole process is that it is not complex, but it is complex. You need to understand it. If you understand the basics of customized employment, if you understand the philosophy behind it, and particularly the elements, and deliver it with fidelity to the model. Don't simply go, I'm going to do discovery and then go and do resumes and things like that. Like I've said, we very rarely use resumes. As a matter of fact, one of the things that people often forget is that work experience in itself is actually a live job interview. It's a resume by itself. So you go out and you do an informational interview, and what you tend to find, or what actually does happen and should happen, is that the person you're supporting and the employer are having a conversation. And the employer, and in my experience, everyone that owns a business that I've ever come across is more than happy to talk about their business and show people through it. I mean, I don't do informational interviews very much these days, simply because I put weight on, because I'd end up in coffee shops and things like that. What I'll do is I can see everybody wants to know about the categories. Yes, I'll make that available. I'll put a link on our Facebook page. Examples, the best way to start a conversation with employers. Right, okay. And again, this is the thing about getting outside of your comfort zone. When I go and do this, and I was training some staff in Maroochydore a few months ago, and the simple thing for me is I sit and observe a business, and in funny ways, the phrase is called lurking with intent, something I coined years ago. That might sound creepy, but this is where I intentionally sit there and look at what's going on in a business. Who's doing what? Who's the boss? And often what I'll do is I'll wait for a quiet period of a business. And I think we have some informational interview videos actually on our YouTube channel. But I'll simply go in and say, look, I don't hide from the fact that I'm working with people with disability. I simply go in and say, look, my name's Pete Smith. I work with people with disability, and often they want to pursue employment, and particularly in businesses like yours. I'm not an expert. I know nothing about it. I'm not looking for a job or anything like that for someone. I just want some information about, what sort of classifications of people you have, what sort of skills do they need to have, qualifications. Can you give me a few minutes? And what I tend to find is almost invariably I end up with 15, 20 minute, a half an hour conversation. I went into a small coffee shop one day and discovered that they bake all their own breads and things like that. I spent the next hour at the back in a bakery, and I was shown every process from start to finish, making the dough, proofing it, the whole lot. How they did it, and then out the front, this is our coffee shop where we serve a lot of our stuff as well as supply other organisations. A cafe I went to up on the Sunshine Coast at Maroochydore, what I discovered was that they have 5 chefs, not cooks, but chefs. Why do they have chefs? Because they have a bakery through that door, and they bake bread for just about every restaurant in the area. So you discover things that you can, okay, that's a coffee shop. No, it's not. Yes, it is a coffee shop on this side, but on the other side, behind the door, is a fully fledged commercial bakery that supplies the pub across the road, the coffee shops down the road, etc. So these are things you don't see. So simply go and introduce yourself and say, I don't want anything. I don't want a job. I just want information. Like I said, I've never met only one person that didn't want to talk about their business, because I didn't want anything, just information. And that's that reciprocity, because I'm not putting the word on someone, because you know what, as an employer, you get bombarded with applications and people who are just ticking boxes for government benefits. And as much as you'd like to support everybody, that can be annoying. And if you're doing it 40, 50 times a day, generally what's going to happen is most people are going to go, no, I don't want to talk to you. I don't care how good you are. But if you go in there and all you want is information and it's a quiet time, I almost guarantee you 99% of the time, they will take the time to do that. I did informational interviews in a suburb in Melbourne with some staff I was training, and we ended up in a jewellery store. That was a mistake because the 2 women I was with, they just loved the jewellery. And it turned into a bit of a shopping expedition as well. That's a danger. I myself, I'll admit, I brought jackets and all manner of things in shops. If you could see behind me, there are pieces of pottery and things that I brought in shops all over the world where I've done informational interviews. So to get back to it, and I'm waffling a little bit, I'm sorry, but go in there, introduce yourself and say, this is all about information. And don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone. And it is, for a lot of people, a challenge to go in and have a conversation with a stranger. But you know what? You're doing it for a reason. It's got a purpose. You don't want anything. You just want information. So that's the simple way to do it, Reese. That's how I start a conversation. And, I think one of the myths, one of the fourth ones is this idea that employers don't want to hire people with disability. That's a nonsense. People will hire anybody if they can do the job or they have the right supports. We just have to stop creating all these myths around employing people with a disability and go and do it properly. All right? Because every time you engage with an employer, what you're doing is you're creating awareness, you're taking barriers down. So go and do informational interviews. Go and build a network up of people that you've done informational interviews to, because you know what, they then discover that, hey, I know this guy, maybe he's got a staff member, because they know that you help people, and they go, you know what, let's have a talk to Reese or whoever and see if he knows someone that might be interested in working here, because I've got someone that wants to work 20 hours a week. Invariably, what I end up with informational interviews is an employer will say, look, if you've got someone in mind, bring them back next week. Bring them back at 3 o'clock, a couple of hours in the afternoon where it's a bit quieter. I'll give them a bit of a work experience and see if they actually like this. Then we can have a bit of a chat with a purpose. Hey, you're on your way to a job. It's that simple. Right. How are we going for questions? All right, just burn up our time. Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, what we might do is we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attending today. This will be up on our YouTube channel later today, where you can view it, download it, and share it if you like. If you want to know more about CDERP, there's a QR code there. There's a QR code there for our Work First program. Have a chat to Jenny, who runs it. And of course, they're all our training programs sitting behind the college. So thank you, everyone. I try to do this regularly, every month to 6 weeks. I try to not to waffle too much, but I figure if I can get a few more facts across, a bit more information, and educate us all a little bit at a time, it's going to help everybody at the end of the day. So thank you, everyone. And if you want to have a chat to me, there's my email address there. You can probably discover, I can talk underwater, and I'm more than happy to have a chat at any time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.